Marta, Havryshko, thank you so much for coming back to Useful Idiots.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a while since we covered Ukraine on the show, so I just want to start by asking you, what is going on? Or for people who are not following the day-to-day of the conflict, what do you think is most important for people to understand about the current situation inside Ukraine?
So the current situation is very dire due to different developments. First of all, severe Russian attacks. Now, it was a new record when Russia, during one night, sent more than 700 drones across Ukraine to attack different Ukraine cities and to attack Ukraine infrastructure. And of course, we have the damage of residential buildings as well, and deaths and injuries of civilian people, including children. So basically, war is one of the most important factor. But the second factor, and according to some polls, is even bigger trouble for some Ukraine, is the corruption. Almost every single day, we have new corruption scandals. For example, the deputy prime minister Chernyshov, who recently had business travel abroad, and some journalists assumed that he escaped from Ukraine because he was accused of corruption. And this is huge corruption scandal because the damage to Ukraine budget was approximately 1 billion hryvnias. And guess what? Ukraine court just released him without, fire him, and with, this bail that is very small in comparison to damage to Ukraine government. Every single day, Ukrainian people see how, top politicians, members of parliament, members of government, and their relatives buy new cars, buy new apartment in Ukraine and abroad, in US and in Europe. But every single day, the same ordinary citizens are required to donate for the army, to buy necessary stuff, even to buy weapon. So basically, this situation, the corruption, still one of the biggest problem in Ukraine. And recently, Ukraine people found out that many prominent journalists, they basically are cooperating with security service of Ukraine and with military intelligence of Ukraine. But at the same time, they label themselves as, independent journalists, investigative journalists. So basically, it's a total distrust nowadays in Ukraine in the whole, governmental system. And many people don't believe that, Zelensky team is handling the whole situation very good, because we observed this, clash, this disaster at the Oval Office. After that, Zelensky had several meetings with Trump, and Trump said, oh, it was a good conversation, but still, despite of this good conversation, we observe how Trump held delivering weapons to Ukraine. So basically, the situation is very dire, and nobody understands what is the plan, how to defeat Russia, how to regain lost territories with the enormous amount of deserters from Ukraine army. And numbers are different according to different sources, but at least 200,000 people deserted from Ukraine army. So the lack of the infantry people, the lack of soldiers, the lack of weapon, the lack of, these sufficient support from the West, because we observe even neighboring Poland, people are tired of this war, and many of them don't want. Only approximately 15% of Polish people want to send their sons, their husbands to Ukraine. to fight Russians. So basically, no one wants to send their loved ones to die for Ukraine, for this corrupted government, for this ethnic nationalist politics, and with neighboring countries, Poland, Hungary, Romania, we have so many tensions in regard to language question and other questions in humanitarian politics. So Ukraine people are frustrated, many of Ukraine people, and they don't see the light in the tunnel. What next? Merz talked about, towers for Ukraine. We will support as long as it took. But nowadays, what we observe: pause in delivering weapons, blah blah blah, many talks, and only small baby steps. And in this configuration, Ukraine has no chances to regain lost territories. Those who observe closely how many territories Ukraine is losing every single day, it at least 15-20 square kilometers per day. And those scandals with the lack of this infrastructure that could halt this Russian offensive. So people asking, what have you done for strengthening Ukraine defense system? Why? Where are those money? You talked about this all the time. You invaded Kursk, and you explained Kursk region in Russia, and you explained to ordinary people that this was such a great operation. And so now Russians are retaliating because they want to at least create this security zone, and prevent another attack of Kursk region, of Belgorod region. And so even Bieletsky, this, celebrity Azov commander, when he was asked about Kursk operation, he said, at the beginning, it was a good, result because it boosts morale of Ukrainians, and humiliate Putin and his generals. Yeah. But what happened next? We will talk about this, history will judge. So he avoided even to express his criticism of this operation. And many, commanders are very critical of this operation. So basically, I believe the main mood in Ukraine is disappointment. Yeah. Regardless of these cheering comments from state control media that are trying, to talk about resilience, and, those Ukrainians who want to rather die, experience glorious death for Mother Ukraine than, raise their children, in peacefully. So it's insane.
Let me show you a headline from a Ukrainian outlet that speaks to the long-term problems that Ukraine faces now on top of the immediate. This is what it said. Ukraine has already lost 40% of its working age population, according to the Ministry of Social Policy, which also says that to restore the economy, Ukraine needs to attract an additional 4 to 5 million workers. Talk to us about this and what this means for the country's future.
Exactly. When people, those in the West who are, I call them, keyboard warriors, who are, just cheering, waving Ukrainian flags, put on their social media, Ukrainian flags that stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraini, and be brave as Ukraine. They're just, they watch this, as a video game. They really, for them, it's very interesting, all these developments, how, people to observe how people are dying, on the battlefield, and how they are persecuted by drones. But war is not only the battlefield. Battlefield is most visible. Combat is most visible. Yes, we talked about different numbers, about wounded soldiers, about soldiers without limbs, about missing soldiers, about killed soldiers. But war basically has so many dimensions. And one of these dimensions connected to this situation with workforce. Ukraine experienced enormous lack of workforce. And nowadays, Ukraine officials are talking about inviting people from Argentina, Colombia, Bangladesh, and other countries. And this discussion is very tense. Why? Because many people consider this question in terms of this anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric that is on the rise in the West. And due to this rhetoric, many far-right in different countries, including Germany, Austria, Sweden, other countries, France, gain popularity. And many, especially far-right, they are so concerned because they are saying, white men are dying in the battlefield. And what will happen next? They will bring, brown people, black people, not Christian people. So they consider this as a security threat for Ukraine. So there is no a good solution for this. And as long as war will continue, the more people will leave Ukraine. Even today, I have so many of my acquaintances and friends and relatives who consider to take their sons abroad before they turn 18, just in order to give them better perspectives and in order to spare them from this forced mobilization, in order to give them a future, basically, at least some future. Because what Ukraine proposed, Ukraine officials constantly say, you should prepare for long war, you should prepare basically for forever war. So what next? People can't understand what is the plan. And more people, I mean, not only women who face no restrictions in movement, I mean men, are paying tens of thousands of euros and dollars just to escape Ukraine. They use different ways, they pretend to be, volunteers, they pretend to be musicians, they pretend to visit, some conferences abroad, and then they never return to Ukraine. So they pay for this, for these excuses, or they are hired by some, politicians as their drivers, and they just escape Ukraine. I was so shocked when, I left Ukraine, as some of our reviewers maybe know. I escaped Ukraine almost immediately after Russian attack in February 2022. But I often visit Europe for different academic events, academic conferences. So basically, in 2022, when I visited, Czech Republic and Germany, most of Ukraine refugees were women and children. Year after that, in 2023, many of Ukraine refugees, and they hear Ukraine Russian language and Ukrainian language, were men. They were young men of the draft age with their families, with small children. So many men basically are very open about this. If you want forever war, send your children. Why your children are here? Why, a son of the ex-president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, is avoiding draft and ignores draft, messages, and he's living his luxury life in Great Britain. Why Klitschko's sons are in Germany? Why so many politicians have their sons here in US, where the education is so expensive? I teach at Clark University, and I observe it's enormous prices for Ukrainian people. The average salary, monthly salary in Ukraine, is approximately $600. But we all know how much Ukraine officials pay for the education of their children here. And, many of them are politicians without business involvement, without any business, without any commercial activity. So basically, they just stole this, money, these funds from Ukraine budget, allegedly. And their sons are, so basically, what we observe now, rich people in Ukraine getting more rich due to the war and, different schemes, and poor people became even more poor because they can't pay the bribe to avoid forced conscription.
Yes.
They are sent directly to the infantry and to the most heavy battles.
The last time we had you on the show, we played footage of just some of the basically kidnappings of people being taken off the street to go be enlisted, to be forced to fight. Recently, Russia has been bombing some of these Ukrainian recruitment centers, and there have been like reports of some Ukrainians on social media basically cheering this on because these recruitment centers are seen as the symbol of tyranny, forcing people to go off to die who don't want to. Now, I want to read you something though from the Washington Post in reporting on this. This is what the Washington Post says about the issue of military recruitment inside Ukraine. There is a great deal of Russian-sponsored content and propaganda on social media maintaining that Ukraine engages in highly unpopular forced recruitment of its citizens. So that's the Washington Post. I mean, is this just Russian propaganda that Ukraine is sending people off to die and engaging in what it calls unpopular forced recruitment?
Actually, of course, Russia instrumentalizes this, this tension, this anger, this frustration, because military draft officers, recruitment draft officers in Ukraine are associated with dictatorship, are associated with deprivation of basic human rights. And many people can't understand why they should die for this corrupted state, why they should die for autocracy. Because Ukraine is on its way to dictatorship. Because many signs, and we can talk about this later. So basically, yes, Russians are trying to instigate this anger. They are trying to support these people, but it's not only Russian propaganda and some Russian trolls, paid trolls. Why I'm saying this? Because after this, strikes on several recruitment centers in Zaporizhzhia, Kryvyi Rih, Kremenchuk, Poltava, many people, when you witness on social media how people comment on this, it was a humiliation for Ukrainian government and for military commanders. That's why it was even an appeal of command of ground forces published in one of the mainstream Ukraine media, Ukraine Pravda, Ukrainska Pravda. It was appeal to the people, please stop. Those people are your defenders. They are part of Ukraine military, of Ukraine army that defends you from Russian, hordes, orcs, and all this stuff. You should support them, not to cheer their deaths and, those wounded soldiers who were inside. And so many celebrity commanders, military commanders who are very present on the media, they pause their, outrageous pause. How dare you? We defend you. Stop laughing. Stop being happy about this. And security service of Ukraine started to trace all those comments. And yesterday, one man already was interrogated, and they make sure that this information will be leaked to the press in order to give a lesson to other people. Please stop doing that, or you will face punishment. And we know recently, UN released a report about the human rights in Ukraine, and there is a great skepticism about the punishment for so-called collaboration. So the collaboration is such a broad definition in Ukraine that dozens of people are put on trial and charged with treason for comments on social media like this, like cheering these attacks on recruitment centers. So basically nowadays, everyone who is critical about, for example, personal sanctions against, Ukraine imposed by Zelensky and against his critics, or is not happy about beatings, kidnappings, and killings of people in territorial recruitment centers, they could be blamed for spreading so-called Russian propaganda to be the paid Russian assets and of treason. So basically, nowadays, martial law gives a lot of, free hand to security service and to all these law enforcement that use even selective military draft as a punishment against, human rights activists. Yesterday, one of the journalists who was highly advocating deeds of, draft officers, violent deeds. He was drafted. Why? Because he criticized the government. And people say, why? Why are you doing that? So basically, the government is sending a signal to all those critics. You can be on his place. You can be drafted easily, and sent to the front line, to the very hell. And guess what? What will happen to you, And what I must say regarding territorial recruitment centers, I invite our listeners and viewers to check the latest Viktor Orban post with condolences to one of their men, 45 years old, from Transcarpathia. It's a Ukraine region, and this guy had both Ukraine and Hungarian citizenship, and he experienced forced mobilization, and he was so severely beaten that he died 3 weeks later. So basically, those stories are almost absent in Western media because they don't want to undermine these forced mobilization. Yes, because many of yes, thank you so much.
We're showing his picture on screen for our audio audience.
His sister shared the news about him and all the details about him, and he's not the first victim. We know so many little cases in different regions of Ukraine. Recently, the guy he was basically his father. He was a combat volunteer. His father was proclaimed missing on the battlefield 1 year ago in Pokrov, somewhere in Pokrovsk region. So he should be exempted from the military, but he was attacked by draft officers. He was beaten allegedly, and he died. Also, he died. He was 31 years old. So only in the past years, we found out 2 cases of deaths of those who experienced forced mobilization. And we all understand that during martial law, many people in Ukraine are not willing to expose this information, to make it public, because the trust to law enforcement in Ukraine is approximately, 10%. Nobody, because of the extreme corruption in this judicial system, in the police system, nobody trusts the government, but they really believe that they can face retaliation from the government. They can lose their, jobs for the criticism and exposing this information. They can be drafted to the military, or their relatives can face repercussions. So basically, it's only the top of the iceberg that we observe, but many people experience in Ukraine this, beating. Because why? One of the reason, because draft officers were given free hands, because commanders, soldiers, experts, they say in one voice, infantry, we need infantry. We running out of soldiers, and nobody wants to go there. I observe, these thousands of NAFO fellas on the internet, these brave, armchair warriors, and nobody wants to go to Ukraine infantry. Nobody wants to experience, chasing by a Russian drone. Nobody wants to live their rest life without, limbs, without, penis, or without, eyes. So it's obvious that for many people, it's just game when real people are dying in Ukraine.
Let's talk about one of the Zelensky government's more recent and controversial appointments. Ukraine has something called the Institute of National Memory. It's basically a division of the government. And they've just appointed this man to head it. Let's show him on screen. His name is Alexander Alfyorov.
Alfyorov. It's a very Russian name, actually.
Well, and talk to us about who he is. Talk to us about who he is.
So basically, Alexander Alfyorov is a historian, is a PhD, So he's basically was trained as a historian. He's a scholar in Ukraine. He has a very popular blog in Ukraine about Ukraine history, and many of these, his TV shows are dedicated, I would say, to decommunization and de-Russification of Ukraine history. So basically all this stuff. But what is more important? Alexander Alfero was a press officer of Azov regiment in 2014-2015, when this regiment was accused for so many war crimes in Donbas region, and when members of this regiment were very open about their neo-Nazi views and making Nazi salutes very openly, and they were very open extremists. After that, after 2022, he joined the Special Operation Forces Azov Kyiv and then became an officer of the Azov 3rd Assault Brigade, responsible for humanitarian question and, ideological question. So basically, for the ideological training of young men who are recruited, who are lured to the army. So basically, he's telling them that glorious death for Ukraine is the best option for you, and you will be celebrated as hero. So go, and enlist and experience this, a great glory. But what is important about Alfero as well? The 3rd Assault Brigade in 2023, in one of the biggest museums in Kyiv, organized a photo exhibition that showed at least three photos of Waffen-SS Division Galicia. It was the collaborationist Nazi military formation that keep oath to Hitler and fight for Nazi Germany and committed war crimes in Slovakia, former Yugoslavia, and other regions. Some of the participants of this Waffen-SS Division Galicia participated in operation of Warsaw Uprising, in punitive operation against Polish people in Guta Poniatska and other cities in the territory of Ukraine and Poland and Belarus and others. And many of them actually were members of auxiliary police. So basically they were involved in the Holocaust. So this guy actually curated this exhibition, and guess what? Members of his brothers in arms, members of his assault brigade, they reenacted these photos. So basically, they compared themselves to Nazi collaborators, not Putin, not Skabeva, not Solovyov, or other top Kremlin propagandists. They themselves. And this exhibition was curated by Alfero. And guess what? Recently, when he was appointed, many people started to talk about his background, about his use, and we found an interview recorded last year when he praised Hitler. He compared Hitler to Putin and said, oh, no, we can't compare those figures because Hitler, he received high German education. He was acquainted with high German philosophy and music. So basically, he advocated Hitler. And then, I listened to this interview, and as a Holocaust scholar, as a, person who teach Holocaust, I'm a Holocaust educator, and I listened how he started to defend, he said, Russians are trying to develop this myth that all Ukrainians are anti-Semites. And guess what? During the period of Ukrainian People's Republic, proclaimed in 1918, it was, separate state from Russia for the first, time in 20th century. They even organized the Ministry of Jewish Affairs, and they have the banknotes with Yiddish. And it was true. But then he stopped. But what happened next? The wave of anti-Jewish pogroms perpetrated by the army of these republics, and tens of thousands of Jews were killed, were wounded, were robbed, and were raped. And it caused one of the biggest wave of immigration to United States. I have so many students, my students here at Clark Universities, whose relatives came as a result of these pogroms. We know that many actors perpetrated those pogroms, including, White Army, Белогвардейцы, and even some, parts of the Soviet army. But the most pogroms were perpetrated by those, Ukraine nationalists, but this Ukraine army of Ukraine independent state. But he's saying nothing about this. So what do you expect from this guy on this, and I must say, this is the main national memory actor in Ukraine. It's a governmental institution. And we know that at least 50% of Ukraine budget is filled by Western countries, and all salaries of all government workers are paid by Western taxpayers. So I want to ask those Holocaust scholars, Holocaust descendants, Holocaust survivors, are you ready to pay him salary? Do you want him on the top of this, institution in charge of creating national memory in Ukraine? It's a shame.
These are questions. These are questions that I wish our media asked, but unfortunately, still not allowed to be discussed in the mainstream. We're going to wrap, Marta. So you said earlier that you're worrying that Ukraine is becoming a dictatorship. Is there any aspect of this that you haven't discussed yet in our conversation that you want to make sure we address before we wrap?
I want to address the question of so-called personal sanctions imposed directly by Zelensky. So in past weeks and months, Zelensky, by his personal decisions, imposed personal sanctions against some politicians, journalists, and bloggers. Most of them, of course, escaped from Ukraine, including Arestovich, his former advisor, who is very critical of what is going on in Ukraine nowadays. And this list is very wide and includes, people like, Bondarenko, who wrote this book, Joker, very critical towards Zelensky. So basically, many human rights organizations even in Ukraine. And recently, the Council of Europe Commission for Human Rights, they paid attention for this, and they are very critical of this because it's against, those sanctions are against Constitution. Because in order to impose sanctions, you need to prove that those people are involved in some terrorist activity and this must be proved in the court. But what Zelensky did? He did this against, all Ukraine laws, and it violates not only Ukraine constitution and Ukraine laws, but also those laws and international treaties signed by Ukraine. So basically those who say, oh, Ukraine is such a vibrant democracy. No, guys, no. And what we observe, many media in Ukraine which were financed by USAID and pretended to be, liberal, independent, media, now they join this, bullying of these people sanctioned by Zelensky. They justify this to the public. They use slurs against those people, strong words, but the only, their fault is the harsh criticism of Zelensky and his team and the corruption and how they handle the war and how, they protect the children of their own, bodies from the front, because in Ukraine, military draft is very selective and targets, and it's used as a punitive instrument against dissidents, against some politicians. We know that Poroshenko is sanctioned nowadays. He can't freely, visit some, meet with some politicians abroad. So basically what we observe now, it has nothing to do with democracy. And if Zelensky will keep his power, I believe Ukraine will be rapidly turned into authoritarian state. But in the West, we have complete silence and justification because Ukraine are fighting for, it's an existential war. Yes, it is existential war for Zelensky regime and for his buddies, because war secures their political influence and their political power.
Yeah.
because
And for us, it's a proxy
yeah,
war that is being used to bleed a rival, Russia.
exactly. And many Western politicians are so open about
Yeah.
this. Yeah, German commanders, we want to keep Ukraine fighting at least until 2030 because we should prepare, we should rearm. So how many Ukrainians should die to protect Europe from Russia and to satisfy the needs of, those warmongers in the West?
Another question that's just not being posed enough. It's in fact not being posed at all in the mainstream. And if we had a functioning democracy, it would. Marta, it takes a lot of courage to speak out the way you have. We're very grateful to you for joining us and sharing your insight. Marta Havryshko, visiting assistant professor at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Thanks so much.
Thank you.